according to the British Foreign Secretary, the most persecuted group under most attack around the world right now, Christians. Here's a line from the report that was written. In some regions, the level and nature of persecution is arguably coming close to meeting the international definition of genocide, according to that adopted by the United Nations. That's from the report from the British government. The BBC has picked up on this and written about it. A few other British papers have as well. A smattering here in North America, but for some reason, this story has been heavily underplayed. You probably have not even heard about this. You may have heard of what happened in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday with the attacks, but that was unusual. Well, apparently it's not unusual. Apparently it's very common right now. We're just not hearing much about it. I want to bring in Dr. David Haskell, who's an associate professor of religion and culture at Wilfrid Laurier University. Dr. Haskell, thanks for doing this today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So have I simply just missed the coverage on this, or has it been largely absent?
No, you are right to say that it's been largely absent. And in media, we have these news values that make a story really worthwhile. And you were talking about the report that the Foreign Secretary of the UK put out. And I mean, this is how dramatic it is. This is 80% of persecution for faith happens to Christians. This is a significant report. And from my own gleanings over the internet and watching the news, I haven't seen anything in the national news in Canada related to this. You mentioned that it is getting some traction in the UK, but here in Canada, almost nothing. And it's got me thinking about why that might be the case, and maybe we'll dig into that a bit.
Well, let's go there. Why is that the case?
So I'm looking at it, and I see that we've got actually three problems. The first problem is that Christians are being killed at a level that is almost nearing the definition of genocide. So that's a huge problem. But then we see that potentially the media is complicit in this, in that it is definitely underreporting. It's underreporting the situation. So that's another problem that I want to talk about. And then we want to say, why are they not talking about who's doing the persecution? That's another thing. So let's look at the first one first. Why is it underreported? And my best guess would be, and this is looking at surveys of journalists themselves and also of politicians on the left. So journalists at the national level tend to be more left-leaning, and politicians also have the same kind of mindset when they're left-leaning. There's this sense that Christianity is part and parcel of what we'd call the Western tradition or Western institutions. And there's been a real movement since the 1960s to demonize these Western institutions and Western traditions. And when you look at the force behind the traditions and the institutions, you'll often find Christianity. The law system in Canada and the West in general has foundations within Christianity, but not everything is seen as the beautiful stuff, like our freedoms. They also look at the negative things, colonialism, and in Canada we would maybe even cite the residential school system, for example. But what happens in our educational system is that we have this asymmetrical pedagogy, and it's a term that's getting used more often, but what it is, it's a highlighting of the negative and a diminishing of the positive. So maybe if you were going to school in the 1950s, you would have heard about the good things that Canada did, the movement toward progress, and you would have also heard about some of the negative things that happened along the way. Human beings do negative things, and these things are going to happen, and they need to be talked about. But now with this asymmetrical pedagogy, what you're getting is an emphasis on the negative. So someone attending school from the 60s, and it's really just gotten worse as we've moved through the decades, they've now come to believe that Canada, the West, the institutions of the West, including Christianity, are very negative and suspect. So when you have that mindset, you're really going to be quite cautious about giving support to those institutions, including Christianity. So what
Let me jump in for just 1 second, because
Yeah.
you mentioned this, and it's interesting, because Jeremy Hunt, who's the Secretary of State for Britain, who's the guy who's behind this report that Britain put out there, something he said, this is a quote of his: "I think we've shied away from talking about Christian persecution because we are a Christian country and we have a colonial past, so sometimes there's a nervousness there." So, in other words, if I'm interpreting what he's saying correctly, we don't really, or Christians don't really fit the narrative of victims, therefore we don't really like to talk about them in that sense.
And this is exactly right. But let's dig a little bit deeper with that. Right now, if you attend any university, and your listeners may be familiar with this, almost everything in your arts programs and your humanities programs is presented as a conflict between the oppressed and the oppressor. And it's a very, very simplistic lens. But when that lens is used, Christianity always falls on the side of the oppressor. And you don't want to support the oppressor. And in good fashion or good political correctness, you're shy about saying anything good about Christianity. Now look how warped this is. Here we have people in developing countries, Christians in developing countries, who are being killed, and people are afraid to speak out in support of them because there's this larger narrative that somehow Christianity is the oppressor, which, by the way, in point of fact, in terms of historical evidence and social scientific evidence, is completely false. If you look at the larger record, Christianity has been the single greatest force for good. We don't have time to go there, but there's an example of this. I don't know if you're familiar with the tweets that went out.
David, I'm going to jump in for just a second, because we do have to take a quick break here. Hang on the thought about the tweets. We're going to come back and and keep going with that right after this. Stay with us. Scott Radley Show, talking with Dr. David Haskell from Wilfrid Laurier University, professor of religion and culture, about a report from the British government that the number one group that is being persecuted and facing genocide, that's their word, not ours, around the world is not Jews, is not Muslims, although they are certainly facing their issues and their problems too, and we're not underplaying that. But the number one group facing these problems right now is Christians, which is something that I don't think too many people listening probably have heard much about. David, you were talking about, I'm going to let you continue the story and continue the point you were making just before the break.
So where I was going, Scott, was I was saying that there really is this desperate need among those on the left, whether they're journalists or politicians, to not be seen in the supporting Christian camp, like they're trying to avoid it. So an example that came to my mind was the recent tweets that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, sent out after the Sri Lanka bombing. So in Sri Lanka, there were bombings, about 300 Christians died. They were at Easter Sunday church services. So their churches were bombed and they died. And we had Clinton and Obama sending out these tweets. But in the tweets, they were really bizarre because both of them avoided using the word Christian to say who had been killed. And they actually invented a new word. Instead of calling the dead people Christians, they called them Easter worshipers. And equally odd was they didn't say churches had been bombed. And it's to my mind, this is just emblematic of this larger issue of we don't want to make it seem like Christians are being persecuted. Now, there's a double standard here because, weeks before when there was the Christchurch bombing, the shooting in Christchurch at a Muslim mosque, both Obama and Hillary Clinton were very, very clear that they were standing firm with the Muslim community. Obama himself said that it was terrible that this would happen in a mosque. So there's this double standard where you can come out very forcefully in support of certain religious communities, but not for Christianity.
Is it conscious or unconscious bias?
I think it's conscious. And I think it's because they've imbibed so long at this really false negative narrative that Christianity is part of the oppressors. So it's hard for them to overcome that.
But the challenge here, one of the things, and I'm digging deeper into this report that the British government put out here, and again, quoting Jeremy Hunt, who's the Secretary of State for Britain, he says, what we've forgotten in this atmosphere of political correctness is actually the Christians that are being persecuted are some of the poorest people on the planet. In the Middle East, the population of Christians used to be about 20%, now it's 5%. So when you're talking about who are the victimizers or the colonialists or whatever you want to call it, that's not this.
No, it's not. And they're definitely overlooking this. But there really isn't a sense of coherence within what we're seeing now in this leftist ideology, there's not a coherence. It's just bad is over here and good is over here, and it's very Manichaean. And you mentioned the political correctness. And what we see in this, it goes to my second question, why are they not talking about who the persecutors are? And there's one of the media outlets to actually report on this persecution of Christians was the BBC. But nowhere in the report does it say who's persecuting the Christians. Now, if you read the actual report that came out from the Foreign Secretary, it tells you that North Korea, China, but overwhelmingly it is Muslim violence against Christians in Muslim-majority countries. And people don't want to admit that there is a real problem in Muslim theology or in Islamic theology in some of these countries that does advocate at a literal level to harm Christians and other people who are not of the Muslim faith. And the problem with avoiding saying this is that we'll never see correction, because criticism brings correction. We've seen it in Christianity. Christianity often goes off the rails. If you look at the historical record, and the thing that brings it back is somebody says, that's too far, that's wrong, and it's persistent criticism that brings correction. But our avoidance of saying, look, there's real problems within the theology of certain Muslim nations and Muslim fundamentalists that needs to change, and it's right in the Quran. You've got to deal with that. One of the things that we have that get people to change is stigmatizing bad behavior and criticizing bad behavior. And it's got to start there. It's certainly not going to bring change if we say nothing.
It is a really interesting discussion. People can go online. Again, the BBC has done good work on this. The report is online as well if they want to read it from the British government. Dr. David Haskell from Wilfrid Laurier University. Appreciate the time as always. Thanks for doing this.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.